Why did you select comic books as a forum for that? Why couldn't it have been a series of essays or articles or whatever?
Because it's a, you know, it just goes along, you know, it's a wonderful medium. It's as good an artistic medium as any other medium. It's, you know, it's words and pictures, and you can do anything you want with words and pictures.
Yeah.
It doesn't, there's no limit to how good the words can be. Yeah. There's no limit to how good the pictures can be. And, but it's, you know, considered a junk medium because it's always been aimed at a lowest common denominator audience.
Sure.
But, you know, I mean, it's, you know, very, you know, the potential of it is just, you know, been, hasn't been exploited to any extent.
Whenever I don't like the latest Marvel movie or some piece of trash like that, I'll get people telling me that I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm a snob who thinks he's too good to read comics, when, in fact, of course, the opposite is true. I've been realizing that a lot of people who know me now from my Star Wars videos or stuff like that don't realize that I've been a writer for a long time, and that I've written a lot of other things, and I've written a lot of things besides comics, but almost all of what I've had published has been comics that I've written and drawn. I write comics, I draw comics, and I read a whole lot of comics. If you ever watch me on a live stream, you'll see me in front of a wall of bookshelves that's about 20 feet of mostly solid comics, and that's just the collected editions. That doesn't even begin to allude to all the long boxes of back issues I have stashed around my apartment. The reason I don't like Marvel movies and things like that isn't because I don't like comics, it's because I love comics, and those movies are a garbage representation of what comics are and what they could be. So with that in mind, I thought it would be a good video idea to rank my all-time best movies that are based on comics. It was supposed to be a top 10 list, but contrary to the idea of me not liking comic book movies, the list quickly expanded to about 14 movies. I'm starting with number 13, but I'll explain the numbering system as I go on. American Splendor isn't a perfect movie, and there are some things in it specifically that I don't like its portrayal of Crumb, which doesn't seem to me to be very accurate, but it's still a good movie, and in some parts it's a very good movie. And since this is a list of comic book movies, it's important for portraying what's an important area in the history of comics.
Thank you, boys. Our next guest tonight works as a file clerk at a Cleveland hospital. He also writes comic books which deal with his day-to-day pains and pleasures, and this is an anthology of 9 of those comics. It's entitled American Splendor. From off the streets of Cleveland, folks, please say hello to Harvey Pekar. Harvey, come out here. Now let's explain to folks who may not be familiar with your work what it is you do here exactly. You have comic books about you in your daily life in Cleveland.
That's right.
And are they embellished at all, or is it pretty much factual?
It's all true, Dad. All true.
Yeah.
Harvey Pekar wasn't the first to write something autobiographical in comics, or the first to tackle daily life in a comic, but he defined the subgenre into something that was so successful that today it's almost become a cliche and got tired again because so many cartoonists do it. But the significance here is that he was saying that comic books don't have to be about superheroes or action or fantasy, and they don't have to be aimed at kids. There had also been comics for adults before him, particularly underground comics that were popular, but most of those were still somewhat surreal or fantasy-based, and a lot of them were working within the language of the form as it existed when it was disposable entertainment for children, like Crumb doing his version of Carl Barks-style funny animal comics, only he subverted the genre by adding drugs and sex and more serious ideas. Harvey Pekar came at it with an interest in the medium itself as opposed to the genres which were well established in the medium already. Since Pekar's comics are based on his own life, there's always going to be a question with them of what's real and what isn't, and what's accurate, and what's taking artistic license, and the movie plays with that in an interesting way by having several of the real people that the comics are based on in the movie talking and giving interviews and intercutting that footage with scenes of the actors playing them. These kinds of scenes are where the movie is actually the most successful, and it also manages to use a lot of the real writing and humor of Pekar's comics, so you also get a feeling for what he wrote. So on the whole, it's a really useful portrayal of what he did and why it was important and how all of that fit into comics history. Since this is a list of the best examples of the medium of cinema adapting art from the medium of comics, the differences and similarities between the two and the issue of fidelity to the source material in an adaptation is something that's going to keep coming up. And by the criteria of how well something does or doesn't adapt its source material, Road to Perdition is an odd one out here on the list because it isn't a whole lot like the comic that it adapts. The basic storyline is still there in the movie, but the characterizations of the people and the story are radically different, and none of the visual style of the comic is kept for the movie, which could be considered disappointing if you were hoping for that, because some of the art in the comic is actually really nice to look at. The movie does maintain a comic book feel, though, and actually reminds me a lot of the look of the Dick Tracy movie. Not in the comic book colors, which that movie tried to replicate, but in the wardrobe and setting, and the kind of stylized idea of noir mobsters in the 1930s, the trench coats and fedoras, and all that kind of stuff that's become comic book staples for mob stories and detective stories, independent of time and place even. And it makes sense that this would have a connection to Dick Tracy, because the book was written by Max Allan Collins, who also wrote Dick Tracy after the original series creator Chester Gould retired, and he was probably the second most successful and influential writer of the comic after Gould. So this feels like a comic book movie in a lot of ways, even though the comic book it feels like isn't necessarily Road to Perdition. In the book, the characters are much broader, less sympathetic, but also more closely based on historical stories, or you could say historical legends, depending on how accurate you consider those stories to be. The movie does a lot to try to humanize the characters, which you could say is a Hollywood failing of always trying to make everybody likable, but it works fairly well in this case because the characters and relationships they come up with make for a touching and a lot of times a powerful story. It's much more poetic and elegiac than the book, and it's probably best if you just view it as a separate thing, because what it is on its own is a good movie.
Just thinking about tomorrow. There's a way that cobwebs and the sorrow till there's none.
I thought I might be adding this one to the list just purely out of nostalgia because I watched it a million times as a kid, but I rewatched it to make this list and I was surprised by how good it really is. I know some people weren't fans of this movie because it takes a number of liberties with the stage musical, but as a movie it's an example of the kind of old school musical which Hollywood used to make a lot more in the 50s and which was pretty rare by 1982 when this movie came out. It's an oddity in the filmography of director John Huston, who's more known for directing classics like The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which came out decades before this. But what he brings to it from being a great director from an earlier era is the old school craftsmanship, which in this case is really just right for the subject matter and really necessary. Everything is shot and staged and choreographed extremely well, which you need for this kind of musical. If you don't like musicals, you probably won't get a lot out of it, but if you do like musicals, it's exciting to see this kind of movie that doesn't really get made much anymore. Wicked is the closest thing in recent years that I can think of, which is still similar to this classic style of movie musicals, which is why I like that movie so much. This movie also has both Carol Burnett and Tim Curry, who I always love to see either of them, as well as Albert Finney, and they're all enjoying themselves hamming it up with these characters. Technically, this is an adaptation of a stage play, which was an adaptation of a comic rather than directly adapting the comic, but as far as being an adaptation of the comic, this is everything you need. Annie and Warbucks and Sandy, Annie's classic red dress, and all of that imagery. This looks and feels like what you'd want from a movie of the comic strip. Attempting to update this for modern times is just a hopelessly stupid idea. The entire premise is about a girl in a Depression-era orphanage. Everything about it is tied to the time and place. In every adaptation, there are some things you can change and some things that can't be changed without breaking the material, and Annie just doesn't really work if the story is set in the 2010s. But I loved this movie as a kid, and I wasn't a girl in a 1930s orphanage, so the idea that you have to update it for it to be relatable is just such limited thinking. You shouldn't just only watch movies to see yourself and your own life on the screen. Sometimes you watch them to see things that you couldn't see otherwise. And just like in something like Dick Tracy, the era and the setting in this movie are such a big part of what makes this movie entertaining to watch. As far as the issue of how to adapt source material goes, the source material for Art School Confidential is a very short strip Daniel Clowes did that was only about 4 pages. So to turn it into a feature film, they had to do a lot of heavy lifting, and the story here in the movie is mostly new. But why I think of it as a great comics adaptation is that so much of it is about artists and the art world, and art and comics are the subject of everything the film is about, even when a lot of it isn't actually based on one particular comic. I know a lot of people don't really like this movie, I guess because it's kind kind of grim and cynical, and the characters are somewhat unlikable. But as somebody who's spent a lot of time around cartoonists and around the art world that this movie shows, I know that the movie isn't all that inaccurate, and it can be cathartic and entertaining to see some of these types of individuals and situations sent up. I'm not naming any names, but if you lived in that world for a while, there would be people you'd want to stick it to, too. Where the movie struggles a little is that the serial killer story they included sits somewhat awkwardly with the lighter stuff about making fun of pretentious art school people, but in the end, how the two stories come together is great, and it's making a point about success in the art world, which is definitely grim and probably unpalatable for a lot of people, but it also isn't wrong. And it's not like the movie becomes relentlessly dark. All of this stuff it gets into is played for laughs. It's just that you really need a pretty dark sense of humor.
So we keep heading east?
Yeah, that's the idea.
This movie is actually one of Cronenberg's more grounded and realistic movies, with less fantasy and science fiction than most of his filmography. So it's interesting that the source material was a comic book. It was a comic book of all things that grounded him a little, which goes to show that comics aren't always more fantastical and less serious than other mediums. A lot of the story of the comic is here in the movie, but much of the look of the comic isn't, which is actually fine for me in this case because I don't really think it's that great of a comic book. This is an example of Cronenberg using the bones of the story but making it very much into a Cronenberg movie. And it works because most of the best aspects of the movie are in how it's staged and shot. Like Road to Perdition, this is a story about a father with a violent past and ties to organized crime and the sins of his past being visited upon his family. But while that one is sort of told like a fable in a stylized 1930s setting, this one is much more about the horror of the violence. That one is more focused on how the son will manage to escape his father's legacy, and this one is more about whether the father can still have a life and a family after the past that he's had. They kind of make an interesting double feature together because they're different riffs on a very similar theme. I'd say this one is a better film in terms of filmmaking, but they don't cancel each other out because the approaches are so different. You also might notice that a lot of the movies on this list are from the 2000s, and I think that we were having a little bit of a golden age then of comics being adapted into movies where the studios had figured out that comic books might be a good source material, but they hadn't yet zeroed in on the MCU formula of making the same piece of superhero shit over and over and over. So at that time, you could have two movies like this one and Road to Perdition, which were both based on adult comic books, were not franchises, they didn't have a superhero protagonist, no built-in sequels were anticipated or required, and they're both completely different takes on the material, and each take reflects what the respective filmmakers could bring to them, as opposed to reflecting Kevin Feige forcing the filmmakers to crank out slop to his tired old formula. The Addams Family is another movie that I loved as a kid, where I was surprised by how good it was when I revisited it for this video. The spirit of the comic is there in the movie, but the original comics by Charles Addams are one-panel gag strips, so adapting that into a feature film requires stretching simple gags like that out to over an hour and a half or thereabouts, and finding some kind of central story to tie them together, which this movie does surprisingly well. The idea of Fester being lost and returning gives you a chance to see the family through an outsider's point of view, which makes the gags work better, and it gives a little bit of emotional center to the story with the characters being reunited with a long-lost family member and all of that, but it also isn't complicated enough to really bog down the movie and plot or explanations, because what you really want here is mainly just the gags. And the way the movie handles the jokes works well too. It could get kind of repetitive for the type of joke that's supposed to be delivered one panel at a time to be repeated for the length of a feature, but they find enough good moments here and enough variety to keep it fun. It's written by Caroline Thompson, who also wrote Edward Scissorhands and The Nightmare Before Christmas, so with as much of a giant Tim Burton fan as I was as a kid, she had this outsized influence on my childhood that I wasn't even aware of at the time. Lots of actors have played these characters over the years, but with Angelica Houston, Raul Julia, and Christopher Lloyd, I think this movie also might have the definitive best Addams Family cast, but maybe I'm biased because I grew up with this before I saw the old TV show. The movie also looks great, although given the subject matter you might kind of think this looks like an off-brand Tim Burton movie. As much of a Burton fan as I am, and as much as you'd think this is material that Burton was born to direct, when he finally eventually got around to making his own version of the Addams Family with Wednesday, that turned out to be one of the least successful efforts of his career, and this movie actually did it better. The sequel that they made, Addams Family Values, actually isn't bad either and has some really memorable scenes, but something about the tone and look of this first one just really seemed to get it right. I've already talked about these movies in both my Tim Burton video and in my Christmas movies video, so I won't go into a ton of detail on them here or break down everything about them that I like, but they're another interesting example of the different routes you can take to adapt something. There are certain core ideas to Batman that are necessary for the character to work, and I've said several times that there's only so far you can bend these things before they break, but there is also room for some amount of interpretation if it's within the parameters of what makes the character work. And in this case, what makes the movies work is that Burton was allowed to make a Tim Burton movie and not roped into a superhero movie formula because that formula didn't really exist yet. The result of what he did was so successful that it basically ended up creating the restrictive template for superhero movies that they all are required to follow now. The problem is, of course, that rather than learning that Burton having the freedom to bring himself to the project was the reason it was a success, studios, of course, saw dollar signs, and by the time of Burton's second Batman movie, they were already fighting with him to prioritize the desires of the people at McDonald's, making Happy Meal toys from the movies over his own desires as an artist. In the desire of the studios to wring maximum profit from everything, they never realized that they're suffocating the spark that made it worthwhile to begin with. You might say that this movie isn't a good example of adapting comics since it isn't all that similar to the source material, but you might have also noticed that this list doesn't have very many superhero movies on it, and the reason for that is almost no superhero movies actually allow the directors to really direct. The characters are too valuable to the studios as properties for merchandising. They're more brand logos than characters to the people that own them. So I include the Tim Burton Batman movies on this list because they were really one of the last times a superhero movie was allowed to be a real movie with a director actually directing it. Speaking of superheroes, maybe I should explain here the thumbnail for this video if anybody still hasn't got the joke. I was thinking about what I could put in the thumbnail without giving away my choices for the list, so I thought it would be funny if rather than putting movies that are actually on the list, I put movies that, if you know me at all or if you've watched any of my videos, very, very obviously are not going to be on my list of the greatest comic book movies ever made. So if you didn't get that and you've been waiting for me to sing the praises of Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, don't hold your breath.
Remember in the 80s, there were tons and tons of headlines just saying, Bamsock Pow comics have grown up. And like they hadn't. There were about 3 or 4 halfway decent comic books, and the rest of it was still the same juvenile rubbish that had been produced for the last 40 or 50 years. What the comic boom of the 80s did was grant a license to a lot of people not to have to actually grow up. By calling them graphic novels, which was a term that I hated because they're not particularly graphic and they're certainly not novels. Usually they're 12 issues of She-Hulk stapled together. That is not a novel. What I think happened was that a lot of people who were just interested in the adventures of Green Lantern, even though they were 35 or 40, having Watchmen gave them a way of saying, oh, look, I'm not emotionally retarded. I am reading, this is a graphic novel that are for adults. No, it's not. It's the same comics that you've been reading for ages. I would feel happier about it if graphic novel actually meant something more than it does at the moment, which is big, expensive comic. And that's pretty much all it means.
Who am I? I'm Kick-Ass.
If you really want me to think of a superhero movie I like after Tim Burton's Batman movies, one that I actually kind of enjoy is Matthew Vaughn's Kick-Ass, which I know probably would surprise some people. It's not as good as the other movies on this list, but now that we're getting to the subject of why there aren't superhero movies on this list, I thought I'd throw it in as a kind of honorable mention, so I'll number it number 14. What I like about this movie is that there's a delicate balance going on here with how you deal with the absurdity of these characters. It's kind of making fun of the whole thing as being goofy and silly, which of course it obviously is, but it still manages to have enough of an emotional core to the characters that it's fairly engaging as a story, rather than just being a farce that gets tiresome and repetitive. I don't think you should deal with the absurdity of these characters by pretending that they aren't absurd, but rather by embracing it and going over the top. Of course, the movie's idea of kind of asking the question, what would it be like if superheroes were real? That's a very tired and played out idea, and the movie doesn't stick to the premise anyway, because while it gives lip service to the idea of this is what would happen to superheroes in the real world, the actual story in the movie movie is just as silly and impossible as any other superhero story. The humor of it going over the top with it is what makes it entertaining as satire. The violence is so extreme that it becomes a cartoon rather than any kind of real violence, so you can laugh at it. The delicate balance here between that kind of violence and also making the character still real enough to be engaging in some way is what I think is impressive about the movie. It owes a lot to its cast, especially Nicolas Cage, who does a great job of playing a cartoon character who still has some amount of emotional complexity. I don't think Mark Miller is necessarily a sharp enough writer to know he was writing a farce here, and what you might think is satirical in the movie might just be what his somewhat Arrested Development thought was genuinely cool in the comic. And I'm not sure either how much Matthew Vaughn was in on the joke, but whatever they were thinking or intending, the final result here manages to thread the needle nicely. If you want to see an example of how similar source material could be handled in a tone-deaf way that makes it fall completely flat on its face, you could just watch Kick-Ass 2 from 2013, which on paper might sound like a similar kind of movie and a similar kind of story to this one, but it's just so unfunny and hateful that it's practically unwatchable. It's also entirely possible that in this case, though, I'm just giving more credit to the movie than it deserves for its, supposed tonal complexity because of the fact that I do love guys with curly hair and I love guys with glasses, and Aaron Taylor Johnson is cute as shit. And in this movie, not only does he have both curly hair and glasses, but he also spends most of the movie running around in a little wetsuit, so there is that. Speaking of tonal complexity, I've gone on a journey over the years with how I viewed Frank Miller's work. When I originally read Sin City at a young age, I loved it because I read it as a satire of all these kinds of noir comics, macho cliches. But then at some point with Frank Miller, you realize he's not necessarily making fun of this stuff. This is stuff that he genuinely likes. But then the stage of enlightenment beyond that is to realize that he likes it as a fantasy and as wish fulfillment. So there still is a certain amount of self-awareness to all of it. Does Frank Miller love big cars and big guns and hookers with big tits? Yeah, I'm sure he does. But does he actually want to live in the world of Sin City? I'm pretty sure that he can see that it's a hellscape. But it's a fantasy and it's wish fulfillment, and writing about your fantasies is fine and valid. So ultimately I have respect for that. I think he's aware that some of this stuff is silly, but it is also representative of things that are valid. I've come to respect Frank Miller as one of the only creators of mainstream comics that's still doing really gonzo personal work that just follows his own passions and inspirations and doesn't pull back and doesn't apologize, and whether you like his subject matter or not, you should be able to admit that he's really, really good at what he does. The Sin City comics are amazingly beautiful to look at. That brings us to the issue of how the medium of film should adapt the medium of comics, because I've had examples on this list that don't try to keep any of the visual style of their source material, and that can work in some cases if the artist working on the film can come up with a worthwhile alternative. But the other approach is to embrace the aesthetic of the source material, and the Sin City movies are one of the all-time great examples of doing that. It's much more necessary in a case like Sin City to keep the visual aesthetic of the source material, because in many ways the comics are a completely visual exercise. The look and the imagery are how Miller is conveying the majority of his meaning. If you had the same stories or the same dialogue but done with realistic settings and normal looking people, it wouldn't be the same thing at all. The visual style is necessary to convey to you the tone or what the stories are about. You can't have a character like Marv without a heightened reality. There's nothing physically possible about him. He doesn't exist independently of the exaggerated aesthetic. The Yellow Bastard is a character that's so over the top that he'd be fairly ridiculous if he was supposed to be a real serial killer, but as a cartoon monster who's actually yellow, he makes a certain kind of sense. I should also explain here my numbering system for this list, since I have two movies here. It's basically supposed to be a top 10 list, but I cheated by including a couple double entries like this one and the Batman movies, and also there are a couple of others like American Splendor and Kick-Ass, which I consider basically honorable mentions because I like them and I wanted them on the list, but they aren't as good as the other movies and I have some problems with them. So if you count the two double entries as one entry each, and you take the two honorable mentions off the list, you'll find out that the list ends up being 10 movies long like it was intended to be. But you could also just say that I'm playing with semantics to include 14 movies on a top 10 list, and you'd be right also. The explanation for the fact of the number of movies on this list being wrong is that it's my list and I can include as many movies as I want, so just, don't worry about it too much. I included both Sin City and its sequel, because I don't think the sequel is as bad as some people seem to think it is, although I don't think it's really as good as the first one. But the reason I think it's not as good as the first one is that they top-loaded the best of Frank Miller's Sin City stories into the first movie, which gave the second movie basically the leftovers and more scattered short segments that don't make up as solid of an experience altogether. The division between the two movies is kind of artificial, though, because they're telling stories taken from throughout 7 of Frank Miller's Sin City books, not 2 books. So you can either look at the 2 movies as 7 different adaptations, or you can look at them together as one adaptation of 7 books. I think that the second way of looking at them is more interesting. I've actually given a lot of thought to editing these 2 movies together and arranging all the stories into chronological order so that it's all one long story. And I think that would actually be really good and improve the whole thing overall. I kind of wish they'd just make an official version done that way and save me the trouble, but if they never do make a version like that, maybe someday I'll make it just for my own amusement and see how it works.
You know, I wanted to hug every moment of this movie. I really loved it. I thought that it was so on target in showing these particular characters and their recognizable types, and you realize that they have these big barriers of irony and sarcasm that they erect between themselves and the world, and yet at the same time they're smart and they're sweet and they're vulnerable and they care. This is a magical movie.
I think of it as being in the same world as films like Sunset Boulevard by Billy Wilder and some of the early Stanley Kubrick films, having this sense of humor that doesn't exactly read as being overtly funny. It's very naturalistic. It's very much a part of the characters and the way they interact.
Adapting Ghost World came with a similar challenge to adapting Art School Confidential, which is another Dan Clowes story, in that both had to be greatly expanded to make feature films. But the Ghost World comic is more substantial than the Art School Confidential story, so there's a lot more of the source material recognizable here in the final adaptation in this one. The book is sort of a mood piece and a character study about 2 girls who just graduated high school and are trying to figure out what they'll do next, and it's great for painting a very sharp, specific, funny portrait of people finding themselves and trying to find a way to transition who they thought they were in high school into viable adults that they can be in the future. A lot of the humor and wit of both the book and the movie come from the very particular things that the characters say and how they say them, and a lot of that survives from the book into the movie. The movie tries to give the story a bit more of an ongoing plot rather than just being episodic vignettes, and it mostly does that by adding the Steve Buscemi character of Seymour, who's probably at least partly an insert character for director Terry Zwigoff, a middle-aged version of who the 2 girls could possibly grow up into. Enid at first pities him and then sees him as being kind of a hero, and then eventually both. He's what she'd like to be and also sort of what she's terrified of becoming. So he's a good addition to the story in that he explores the same material that the 2 main characters are exploring, but from a different point of view and a different stage of life. So it's an expansion of the same material more than a completely different territory.
I came up with these 2 characters, Enid and Rebecca, these 2 teenage girls who were these kind of angry, disaffected girls who were trapped somewhere in suburbia. To some degree, they were alter egos for myself. The character Seymour, played by Steve Buscemi, was a very tiny part of the comic. It was just the scene where they set up the blind date with him in the restaurant, and the way that we leave it in the comic, he just yells at them through the window and walks away, and then they feel really sad and they never see him again. And when we were putting together the script, we thought, you know, it would be really interesting if this character took on a bigger presence in the movie.
When I had just graduated high school, I was probably a lot like Enid and Rebecca. I thought I knew everything and couldn't believe how dumb a lot of the other kids and the people around me were. But at 17, I was still 17, so I was still an idiot too in a lot of ways. Now I'm probably more like Seymour than I'd like to admit.
Come on, what are you, hypnotized? Have some more kids, why don't you? Jesus Christ, move it! Seymour!
The book and the movie are about people that don't quite fit in with anybody around them, but also about how nobody really fits in with everybody else, and they both manage to have a particular whimsical sense of humor about it while also still having this kind of profound melancholy. Harvey Picar's American Splendor comics showed that comics could be about the mundane, they could be about anything, and Dan Clowes is showing that when writing fictional comics that aren't necessarily autobiographical, they can still just be literature about people. They don't need genre material or a gimmick. Everything you probably want to see from the comic survives into the movie, including the humor and the tone, which is a very delicate thing to preserve from one to the other. And the movie expands it with more material that fits seamlessly.
Not a hand was raised in protest.
I already did a whole video about why I love Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy movies, so you can go watch that if you want more detailed thoughts on it. But for this video, I'll just say that it's great. And as to the issue of how to adapt source material from one medium to another, this is one of the greatest examples of preserving the aesthetic of the comics in their movie adaptation. Before technology allowed movies to have the extreme visual stylization of something like the Sin City movies, this was probably the closest a live-action movie had ever come to putting the imagery of its comic source material onto screen. It makes you think that there's a lot more potential for Dick Tracy movies now with the technology that they could use today, but at the same time, they would never do it this well again, and they'd probably try to update it and they'd ruin it, so they should probably just leave it alone. This is the best Dick Tracy movie that we'll ever get, and that's probably fine because it's just about perfect, and so we don't really need another one.
My greatest influence would be Robert Crumb, just because, you know, he invented the whole style of communication that I'm involved in. He sort of spearheaded the whole idea of just doing exactly what you want in the comics form, dealing with issues that you couldn't deal with anywhere else. And he saw the potential of the comic book as something that was really suited for personal expression.
The drawing style is familiar there to anyone who's been following popular art for the last 30 years. It belongs to Robert Crumb, who came out of underground comic books in San Francisco in the 1960s and is now considered one of the great formative influences in comics and satire over the last 3 decades. And if that were all that the new documentary Crumb was about, it would be enough. But Crumb, one of the most painful and revealing documentaries I've ever seen, is about a whole lot more. The movie was directed by Terry Zwigoff, a friend of Crumb's, and he realized Crumb would have never let a stranger get this close. All I can say is, this is one of the most extraordinary and riveting films of the year, and if you see it, you will not forget it.
Well, Roger, you know, just last week I said I don't expect to see a better film this year than Crumb, and I'm sure I won't, because this is why I go to the movies.
Well, it's a great film, and one of the most amazing things about it is that anyone would allow this kind of a film to be made about them.
In my video about Dick Tracy, I said Dick Tracy was the last great comic book movie, so you'd assume that in my list of greatest comic book movies, if something outranks it, it must have been made before, and Crumb was actually made 4 years later. But when I called Dick Tracy the last great comic book movie, I was trying to talk more about movies made with famous comic book characters like Dick Tracy or superheroes or that kind of thing, not necessarily the last great movie with a comic as source material altogether. So Crumb isn't really what I was thinking of when I was talking in that video. Several of the movies on this list were made after Dick Tracy, and they're also great movies, but they're a different kind of thing. Or then on the other hand, maybe I just called Dick Tracy the last great comic book movie in that video to make a statement, and I didn't really mean it literally. Or maybe these are just my lists and I can rank things however I want, and you shouldn't get too hung up on it. Either way, it doesn't really matter, but for the purposes of this list, I would obviously say that Crumb is the #1 movie. Just as a documentary, apart from the fact that it's about a comic book artist, this is one of the greatest biographical documentaries ever made. It's an amazing story told in a way that it could only have been told by somebody who happened to have access afforded to him by being a longtime friend with his documentary subject. Terry Zwigoff knew Crumb for decades to make this movie and to get to film some of the things that he got here. And he also had to put the final movie ahead of his fears of upsetting his friend because some of what he captured wasn't pretty, and Crumb has been pretty open about the fact that he wasn't exactly thrilled with the result here. It's understandable, though, that the subject of a movie like this is not going to enjoy watching the movie, but it's still admirable that Crumb let them make it, and that Zwigoff didn't soften it out of fear of Crumb's response. And I know, by the way, the Zwigoff movies are almost a third of this list, but what can I say? He's really good. He's only directed 5 feature films, and I have 3 on this list, plus I also have Bad Santa on my Christmas movies list, and the other one that I don't have on the list, Louie Bluey, that's a great movie too, actually. So Terry Zwigoff is just a director that never misses. On top of that, his connection to the world of comics makes him the ideal person to make a movie about Crumb or about the works of Daniel Clowes. In addition to how amazing a lot of what he captured here in his Crumb documentary is, he just puts it all together so beautifully well that this movie kind of plays like a thriller. The most surprising and shocking revelations about the people in the movie are all timed and edited perfectly well here to be revealed in a way that makes sense and it isn't sensationalized, but also doesn't lessen any of the impact of the information. You start off with an interesting story of an oddball artist, and then layer after layer is peeled away as new things are revealed and you get closer and closer to the subject. The result is something that's addictive to me to watch. I don't even know how many times I've seen this movie. I suppose you could argue about whether this is really a movie based on on a comic or if it's an adaptation of comics, as opposed to being a documentary about comics and a comic book artist. But to me, in addition to being a great documentary about Crumb's life, this is also about as good of a film version of R. Crumb's comics as we're ever going to get. Many of his comics are autobiographical, or if not based on real events, based very much on his own personal fantasies and psychological hang-ups. And one of the great accomplishments of the movie is the deft way in which it shows you how Crumb's life and preoccupations play into his work. The movie is as much an exploration of his comics as it is of him, and as with any serious artist, you start to see that the two things are basically the same. There are many scenes where true stories from Crumb's own life are illustrated on screen by comics where he told the story himself, and there are many more scenes where Crumb is reading or discussing his comics while they're being shown on screen to the viewer. It's basically like a film of his stories, with him also there to give you his own personal audio commentary at the same time. It's a great portrait of the greatest artist that the medium of comics has produced, and it's also the greatest movie about comics or based on comics that I think has been done to date.
Everybody walks around, they're walking advertisements. They've got advertisements on their clothes, you know? People walking around with Adidas written across their chest, or, 49ers on their hat. Jesus. It's pathetic. It's pitiful. The whole culture is one unified field of bought, sold, market researched everything. It used to be that people fermented their own culture. It took hundreds of years and it evolved over time, and that's gone in America. People now don't even have any concept that there ever was a culture outside of this thing that's created to make money. Whatever's the biggest, latest thing, they're into it. So you just get disgusted after a while with humanity for not having more kind of like, intellectual curiosity about, what's behind all this jive bullshit.